Hi and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. And today I want to talk about self-publishing. And self-publishing is a subject which I have very solid views on, but they are changing. So I thought that'd be quite interesting to look at. And I just want to give you a bit of background. If you're new to the channel, you've not watched before, I work as a frontline new books bookseller, a real bookseller, as I say. I don't work in secondhand, anything like that. I work in a high street bookshop or bookstore, as you say in the USA. And I've done that for 39 years and I've occupied all sorts of positions. I spent 24 years in management. I'm part-time now because I'm an older guy. So I've had a lot of experience on the ground with selling books, buying books in to sell. I talk to readers every single day. I talk to more readers than any publisher or writer ever will. So I'm going to give you some sort of inside dope on things. And I want to talk about self-publishing because it is something that I've changed my view about. They used to say, the old cliche is that there is a book in every person. Now, my sort of cynical statement about that has been, there may well be, but in most cases it should stay there because it's not very good. And, that may seem unkind, but if you're thinking of self-publishing or you've got views on it, you might find this useful because I'm going to talk to you about it from a professional perspective, about what the way things sort of been with self-publishing, how booksellers look at it, and how things have changed with the rise of new tech. So for a very long time, before the internet got going, before we had print on demand technology, which became a very big thing in the first decade of this century, before there were sort of ebooks, which obviously have come on board this century as well, you would buy a book from a bookshop. It was that simple. That's where you went. You went to a bookshop and the books were there and that was it. Now, of course, there are lots of publishers in all around the world, like in the UK. There's at least 40,000 publishers. In the States, I'm not certain. So there's an awful lot of competition, and I've not looked at the figures recently, but for many years you'd have 600,000 books in print in the United Kingdom at any given time. And you'd have about 100,000 new ones, but 100,000 would go to print, and that's titles, not actual individual volumes. So you'd get lots of new titles coming out, and lots going out to print. And most books fail commercially. They don't hit their market, because what you soon realize when you work in the book trade is that it's not really about how good a book is, it's about what publicity it gets. Now, obviously, if you're talking about fiction and the sort of things which get reviewed, like popular narrative, non-fiction, history books, what have you, if they get good reviews, then they sell. Presumably they get good reviews because they're good books, but you're relying on the legitimacy of the reviewer. You're relying on that. So who can say? But of course, you will notice with reviews that it is very often the same small handful of books, especially with general fiction or literary fiction, as people say, that are being reviewed. And you think, how does that happen? Well, it's almost as if the critics are getting together, agreeing what is worthwhile. It also depends what they're sent free as review copies from publishers. And they also, they have to sort of pander to popular taste. They can't keep picking obscure things all the time and saying, by the way, this is brilliant, ignore the bestsellers, because they are working for very often big websites, newspapers, magazines, and there's a certain expectation of popularity and what's in the zeitgeist. And I see that as a problem, but that's another thing in itself. So, as I say, publicity is everything. I know that from my own experience as a writer. My book, 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, you see the flying saucer above my head, which is green. That's the cover of that. That got good reviews in magazines like SFX. It got mentioned in the Daily Mail, of all things. And that meant it went to #1 on Amazon a few months after it was published, in the classic science fiction chart and the literary criticism chart for about a week. So that was great. My second book, 100 Must-Read Books for Men, I was on BBC Radio 4 Open Book, which is Britain's biggest radio program about books. And that meant the first printing sold out in the first few days, and then went into reprint. And then my third book in that series, 100 Must-Read Fantasy Novels, which will be reissued next year, didn't get any publicity at all. I had a new publicist who was green in the job, and she couldn't even get us a magazine review. And the book, people didn't know it was out there, so it sort of crashed without trace. It had one printing, eventually went out to print, never found its audience, so it was a flop. So it's not a question of how good those books are, because the first two are still in print and still selling. The third one is gone because the sales were very slow because there was no marketing. And, if you're a famous author and you've got lots and lots and lots of fans already, the information will get out there in the reviews and what have you. So there is that thing about how it's not how good it is, it's about the marketing. Okay, so what used to happen to me, and this still happens, is in my sort of jobs in various bookshops along the M4 corridor in the UK, people would come along with a book they published, or they'd say, I'd like to speak to the manager or the buyer. I've written this book. And immediately what happens, to be quite honest and to be quite cynical about this, as a bookseller, the alarm bells start ringing and you think, how long is this going to take for me to deal with? Because the reality is, or used to be, if you self-published a book, unless that book had some marketing behind it and some marketing that was relevant to your local audience, you would not be able to sell it. It's that simple. So say, for example, if you were working in a bookshop in Cardiff, as I once was, if somebody came along with a book they self-published, which was set in Cardiff, which had a Cardiff theme, it could be photographs or history, it could be a novel, whatever, then as long as they could get some local publicity in the local newspaper or local radio, what have you, you had a fair chance of selling it because there is an interest. So if you're in Cardiff, you sell books in Cardiff. If you're in Bristol, nobody would buy a book in Cardiff. It's not likely to happen. It's much more likely to happen. So you look at it that way. So that was one area, sort of travel and local history, where self-publishing often did some good things. And a friend of mine, Martin, used to publish a lot of street maps or areas which nobody did street maps for because he's a cartographer. And they used to do really well, so they were self-published. And that would do really well. And he developed a little business out of that, so he went more professional towards proper publishing. But it was initially just regular self-publishing. So what happens for booksellers is when somebody approaches them and says, well, I've written this book and it's a novel, or it's this, or it's that, whatever. And you will tend to ask certain questions, and I'll take you through what I would ask somebody. The first thing I say to people is, who is your book published by, to see if I recognize the publisher. As soon as it's a publisher I don't recognise, the alarm bells start to ring, and I think, well, is this really something? And then I say, who is your distributor? Now, if somebody doesn't know who the distributor is, then that almost certainly means that it's not professionally published, because an important thing of self-publishing, and one of the pitfalls of getting self-published books into bookshops, we'll come onto the internet later, is logistics and distribution. Because if you sort of, the analogy really is like, say, for example, you make jam or preserves or marmalade in your spare time, and you might take them to the fair in the village or the local town, whatever, and have a stall and sell them. People say to you in the street later, oh, wow, that was fantastic, I love those. But you're not exactly going to get them into a supermarket. You're not going to suddenly see them in Marks and Spencer's or Waitrose or whatever the equivalent is wherever you are. It's not going to happen. You're going to have to build up the business slowly, get some branding done, try and get, some proper distribution, and work professionally and put a lot of money and time in, and it's very, very hard. And eventually you may well get your product picked up and have it nationally distributed, and good luck to you, and that's great. With an individual book, that's much, much harder. Even with a line of books, it's much, much harder because there is so much competition. The book is, there are more books than there are any other kind of product. And by that, I mean individual titles. There are twice as many individual book titles as there are, say, record albums. So that gives you an idea. It's twice the size of the music industry in terms of number of titles, and always has been. So there you go. So that's the analogy. So if you self-publish your book and you go to a bookshop and you're talking about a chain bookshop, say something like in the UK it would be W.H. Smith or Waterstones. If you went in the States it would be something like Barnes and Noble. I'm not quite sure what the chain situation is in the States these days because I'm not up to date on the American book trade in the same way as I am the UK one. But fundamentally, if you're like the small sole trader trying to sell this sort of thing informally, it's probably not going to fit into the distribution plans, because big companies, they have things organized logistically so that it's smooth and it costs them less money. So, for example, the sort of firms I mentioned will have their own warehouse. They'll order from all sorts of publishers. The ordering of buying will often be done centrally or by a team of buyers for an entire country over sort of hundreds of shops. They will order books, and those books will go to a single distribution point rather than direct from the publishers to, say, 300 different shops. They'll go to that warehouse and then they'll be sorted, and then they'll go out to the individual shops, and that company will have its own sort of logistics thing going on. So whatever you do as a small publisher has to fit in with that, which is why one of the first questions I'll say, who is your distributor? If somebody says to me, oh, my book is distributed by Gardeners, straight away what that tells me is that it's a very small press book, or it's self-published, and it's mostly going to be self-published. because Gardner's is the UK's biggest book wholesaler. Wholesalers are used extensively by independent bookshops, by small bookshops, because the beauty of the wholesaler is they tend to keep the top end titles and some self-published ones, okay, and they will keep a relatively small range, but it'll be an impressive range, and you order from them and you get your books the next day or 2 days after. So it's very, very quick. Now, before the larger chains have their own distribution and logistics set up, they'd be, reliant on publishers and distributors, and somebody like Penguin might be great in 3 days. If you went to somebody, I'm not going to mention this one in Scotland, that's always been dreadful, you'd be waiting 2 weeks for your books. But the wholesaler, if they stock that title, would get it to you in 2 days. So independent bookshops and small bookshops have long worked with wholesalers, and there used to be a lot of them. Now Gardner's is pretty much, it's not the only one, but it's the only dominant national one. Its only real competition in recent years is a firm called Bertram's. This is another firm been going for decades and decades like Gardner's, and they folded. And Gardner's now pretty much, it's not a monopoly, but it sort of feels like a monopoly. So, they will take on distribution of a book because, of course, every copy they sell, they make some money on, and there's warehousing costs and what have you. So a lot of the time when you order a book for yourself, you go into a bookshop and you place an individual customer order. No matter what you're doing, if it's being ordered in a chain bookshop or independent, it'll be ordered from the wholesaler because the wholesaler will get it quickly. And that's how you work even in a large bookshop. Now, the downside for a large chain bookshop is that you don't get the same level of discounts. You make less money. So the beauty of being, a large concern like WH Smith is you have economies of scale. So you agree your discounts with a big publisher like Penguin or HarperCollins, and you get a really good deal. You get the books from them, they go to your warehouse. That saves the publishers the cost of sending them to 300 different shops. So that's part of the deal. It goes into your warehouse, which is like a funnel, and then it goes out in the vans, lorries to each different bookshop in the chain. So, that's the thing. But if you source books from Gardner's, from a wholesaler like Gardner's, then of course they've got to have their cut. They're imported, a great service. So, obviously you don't get so much discounts. You don't make so much money on that. So making money on individual customer orders is difficult. So if somebody self-publishes a book, manages to get it properly distributed through Gardner's, then that means, of course, the discount is lowered on it. And of course, when you're up against 40,000 professional publishers, a lot of whom have national marketing, ad shelves, reviews, what have you, why are you going to stock that book except as a customer order? Why are you going to stock it when it's not going to get national reviews and there's not going to be massive interest? It's only going to get massive interest locally if you can do great local marketing and it has a local focus. One example where I live in Bath is there's a novel by a businessman, entrepreneur, who's quite well known in the city, and he's worked in his business for a very long time, been very successful, very good businessman, and he's made a great success. He's written a couple of novels set in the city, and irrespective of whether they are good as works of literature or not, he self-published them. He's a good businessman. He knows how to research business. He knows how to make it work. He's done lots of marketing, and he's got lots of money behind him from his successful businesses in other areas. Very, very nice chap, and he's done a real pro job. And he's the exception to the rule. So he will ring up and say, how is my book doing? Would you like some more? And we'll say yes. And then somebody will bring it round to the back door, and we'll circumvent the usual supply chain because there's demand there and we know it will sell and keep selling because it has a local focus. Now, say for the sake of argument, you come and see me and you self-publish your own science fiction novel. What I'm generally going to do is I'm going to say, okay, what's the book called? Who's it by? Etc. I'm going to say, who's your distributor? If you say Gardner's, then I'm going to say, well, that's good. Okay, that means you can send people in and we'll order it for you. But unless it's a science fiction novel set in Bath, and if you're not doing any local publicity with local magazines, newspapers and radio, there's not likely to be much demand. But if anybody wants it, then come in and we can order it from Gardner's. We can do a customer order. Because there isn't a lot of guarantee that we're going to be able to sell it in quantity when we have Adrian Tchaikovsky, we have Andy Weir, we have, all the sort of market leaders who have great backlists from people, and there's the big fantasy boom at the moment. So it's really for the bookshop deciding whether it's realistic and well worth doing when there's all this other competing stuff that's marketing. Also, usually a self-published book will be print on demand. So after a while, it'll I'll come back to this later on. The cover will go like that on a display, okay, because they're not as good. I mean, you can get good paper, but the covers are never as good in terms of the quality of the covers. And I'm not saying that about this book. I'll talk about this book specifically. This is a different case. I'll use that to illustrate something in the second part of this video. But basically, you know, why are we going to do that when there's a nationally published book which we can return as well, okay? Because bookshops will have returns agreements with publishers to return a certain amount of unsold stock. With a self-published book which comes from a wholesaler with whom we don't have the same agreements about returns, and some independent bookshops will, because they will work not exclusively with wholesalers but largely because they have a small stock holding. They can't afford to keep 10 copies of them in stock. They can keep one. As soon as it sells, they can reorder. It comes in the next day, so you get that turnover and you haven't got the money tied up in your shop. You're keeping your cash flow fluid. All this stuff is really important. So it's not that your book isn't good or isn't saleable, it's just how saleable is it realistically in a market which has marketing from big publishers. It's rather like in the days of punk rock, when people started to do independent records. That was different because they used to get covered in the music press. They'd get covered in this NME and Sounds. John Peel would play them because it was sort of a zeitgeisty thing. We don't have anything like that in the book trade, or we didn't, okay? And this is where we talk about the changes later on. So I'm going to ask you those questions. If you come in and you say, I've got a book coming out, and I say, oh, great, okay, who's it published by? And you say HarperCollins. I then say, well, you know, that's great. Maybe we can arrange something. What's it about? Blah, blah, blah. But your publisher will do the selling, and they will sell it into our buying team. They may ask you to go out and help promote it, but the decision to buy it will be made by whoever's doing the buying, whether it's somebody in the store, somebody higher up, or what have you. So there is all that to consider. So if you're self-publishing, generally speaking, 99.9% of the time, you will not get your book into a bookshop. You might get into a small indie because they are more fluid in their business practices. It's easier for them to take money out of the till and just pay you. A larger business has proper bureaucratic systems in place, and they're not just there for bureaucracy, they're to get cost savings to make the most amount of profit. They're done for really solid business reasons. So, you know, the fact is that most of the time, if you self-publish and you go to a large book chain, they will turn you away. It's that simple. And if your book is published by a real publisher, they will say, that's great, okay, well, what's your publicist's name? Maybe we can do an event. You know, maybe it's not for us, but, you know, yeah, we have your book in stock. Do you want to sign a few copies? We decided higher up not to stock this, those sort of things. So that's the whole thing. So that's the difference between professional publishing and self-publishing. I had a quite inquiry the other day from a young lady, and she had written to a firm who I won't name here, and she said, oh, you know, they were interested. And I said, did they want you to pay them? And she said, yes. Now, if a publisher, and we say publisher in parenthesis, in inverted commas, want you to pay them, that's a different sort of publishing. It's not real publishing. It's what was always known as vanity publishing. And vanity publishing is a business whereby you will publish anything by anybody if they pay you, simply exploiting the urge that they've written something and they have to have it in a bound copy. They must have their work in a bound copy, even if nobody ever actually buys it or reads it. They rely on your vanity, as Ecclesiastes would say. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And that's not to say that sometimes it isn't a good thing or the work isn't good, but if the work is good and there is a market for it, it will generally be picked up by a mainstream publisher who will pay you. That simple. These lines are blurring, and we'll come on to that now. So that's the reality of it. If you self-publish a book, you'll struggle to get into a bookshop unless it has a local theme. So say, for example, you live in London and you've written a book about a particular part of London, you've published it yourself because you can't get interest from a bigger publisher, you haven't got time, or you don't really bothered with trying to get an agent and going through all that stuff because it is torturous and it's hard work and what have you. You just want to get it out there. Well, if you go down the road, there's an indie bookshop and they say, oh yeah, we could really do something about the local region. Let's talk turkey, let's do a deal. Then you're fine. Other than that, it's generally not going to happen. Now, of course, things have changed in recent years because of print-on-demand technology and because of ebooks and the internet. So let's talk about that. So really, print on demand is something which started happening in the early part of the 20th century. And when that started coming up, at that point, something I was doing, I was running a university bookshop and I was selling a lot of textbooks. And I did that for nearly 10 years. I did 2 stints in university bookshops. And it's not glamorous, but it is quite exciting. And you sell expensive things. And I really enjoyed it. And it was great working with young people and students and academics. I had a fantastic time I had. And there was an interesting period where, of course, students would come along, people are young, they don't essentially have a lot of money, though the university I worked at, there were quite a few well-heeled students, because there were lots of people who weren't, and you'd have a reading list, and the reading list was for big expensive books. The average textbook for a subject like management or science would be between £30–40. So very often the lecturers were recommending textbooks. A textbook would be £30–40, and it would maybe only be used for 1 semester, or only a part of it would be used. And this was difficult because academic publishers realised that they had to protect their sales and that things might go wrong. So what they decided to do was do a thing where the sales reps from an academic publisher, they would come and see me and sell books into me and other university bookshops around the UK. What they would also do is visit the actual academics teaching the courses. In these instances, they would go along and talk to the academic, and the professor or doctor would say, well, I really like the 3 chapters in that book you do, the 4 chapters in that book, and there's 6 chapters in that one. So what they would say is, okay, well, we'll do a bind up. We'll take the chapters that you like from those 3 books, put them into 1 book, do it print on demand, run off a limited quantity, and it will be an exclusive at the local campus bookshop. You can only get it from the campus bookshop. It'll have its own ISBN and what have you. And I used to love this because it meant that the students, realistically then, they would have to buy this book for the course. It would be £30–40, but they weren't buying 3 books, so it worked for them as well. So it was a good thing. And I got all the sales. I sold a few to the library. The library would have 3 or 4 copies, and I'd get the rest. So it was absolutely fantastic for me and my team, and for my profit and loss account once a month. I would see that, you know, that was a really good thing. So that's one way in which print on demand started to be a thing. Publishers of general fiction, things would go out to print, the cost of warehousing huge piles of books which were slow sellers, but there was still some demand for them. So of course, once they could convert manuscripts to digital files, that meant they could keep the digital file. So if you wanted a novel which was a slow seller, they would not keep physical copies in the warehouse. The person would come into a bookshop and say, I really want that Patrick O'Brien book. And you'd say, well, it's print on demand now, so it might take a week or 2 to get, but I can get it for you. You would order it and a single copy be printed off specially. And that's how it's worked to this day. Before that, books were either in print, meaning they were in stock at the publisher's warehouse, or they were out of print, which meant they'd all sold out, and that was it. They were, the twain never met. It was that simple. A book was in print or out of print. Now it's slightly more ambiguous. The problem with that, and I have this difficulty with my books, is that say 100 must-read science fiction novels had 6 printings where it was just sitting in the warehouse, and the 7th printing, the current printing as such, is slightly different because it's just the digital file is there at Bloomsbury, and when it's ordered, some copies are run off. Now usually Amazon have got about a dozen or 15 on hand because it sells, it ticks over because of this channel, the exposure it gets here. So if you haven't bought it, please do. But what it really means is that with a print on demand book, because the quality of the cover is different, the quality of the paper is different. Actually, with my books, the paper quality is better than the original in print printed editions. It means that generally people won't stock it because it's non-returnable. So, you know, you won't often find my books in bookshops because they're old, because they've been around a while. And of course, most of the sales, most of the marketing is focused around new books and the perennial classics, which manage to transcend that and keep selling and selling and selling. Whether it's 2001 or The Catcher in the Rye or On the Road or whatever you want to name, those things are small in number. So it doesn't really keep it in bookshops. So it's a real thing. So one thing I found with my book on fantasy novels, which didn't sell because it wasn't marketed, is it went out to print, available as an ebook. People want a hard copy of it, so I've tried to reclaim the rights. Now, while publishers produce an ebook copy or print on demand file, the author cannot reclaim the rights, revise and update the book, and or sell it to another publisher. So it's not in the bookshops. Okay, so if I wanted to get my books back into bookshops. I'd have to reclaim the rights somehow, which is hard to do while they're available print on demand and in ebook editions, and still selling. So they sell enough for the publisher to maintain an interest, not enough for them to say to me, update and revise please, though I've managed to do this with the fantasy one because the sales were always quite low and small. So for me to get the other two books into bookshops, because they now print on demand, what I would have to do is somehow reclaim the rights and then resell them to a different publisher, okay, a proper publisher, and not do them print on demand or as ebooks, okay? So, because while they remain print on demand, and when I redo 100 must-read fantasy novels, that will pretty much be a print on demand thing, okay? And I'm not downgrading print on demand, because you get some good results. But the point is that it won't get into bookshops, okay? Now, of course, these days we have other options. The thing I was telling you about sort of having a bind up of chapters from different books, that was quite a big thing around about 2006 to 2010. And I finished university bookselling in 2008. And at that point, there was a lot of concern about ebooks and e-readers. And the thought in the industry was that the first thing that would be really big in e-readers and Kindles and what have you, Kobos, would be the textbook. Because academic journals had gone online. Academic journals had ceased to be print items. They had become online resources instead, because it was far cheaper, far easier, more accessible for researchers and people working in academia, easier for librarians because of the vast amount of space. You just have access to the website, okay? So that was something that's coming. And the result of that, because there was a lot of uncertainty at that point about the way things were going to go, that sort of was a bit of a hammer blow to lots of academic bookshops around the UK and in the States as well. So that's what happened. But as it happened, what really came around instead, you'll remember around about 2011 to 2013, Amazon launched the Kindle Fire, which was a tablet, not an e-reader. An e-reader has an e-ink screen. It doesn't have an LCD shiny screen shooting photons into your eyes all the time, but that's mostly what people read on. A dedicated e-reader, which has e-ink technology, which Sony invented, is much better for your eyes and much more enjoyable to use. I know I've used all of them. I was trained on how to use them and how to sell them back then. Well, basically, it sort of turned out differently, especially because Amazon were very keen to offer best-selling books at low prices. They were also very keen to let people self-publish, and people would self-publish their Kindle ebook. And what's interesting about that is what the Kindle and the other e-readers revealed. It revealed that there was a big market among people who were effectively non-readers for reading matter generally of low quality, okay? It's rather like the pulp magazines. The magazines sort of hit big problems in America in the late 50s because of distribution things and somebody taking over the major distribution for sort of news and magazine things in the States, and that's a different topic. And that really helped the paperback become an even bigger thing in the 60s than it had been in the 50s. So basically, it sort of revealed that people got the Kindle for Christmas, and they were often people who read and people who like reading, and some people loved it. One of my friends, he said, oh, I read so much more now I've got a Kindle, it's absolutely great. And other people got one. After a year or two, they thought, I don't like this, it's a different experience. And the number of times, and I still get this every week, and I've had it thousands of times over the last 10 years or so, people say, you know, I had a Kindle, but I don't like it. I went back to a real book. It's a different experience. And I always say the same thing, which is a book has a soul. A book has a soul. A book is a real thing. It has a physical quality. It has iconography. It has a nice cover. It's different. It's a different experience to reading off a screen. And, you know, a Kindle e-reader's got its place. It's really good for text storage. Excellent for out to copyright things like classics. I got rid of a load of my classics, and I wish I kept them because I was just overwhelmed with the amount of books in this room, and I knew they could always be rebought, and then I wish I hadn't. And then, you know, maybe one day I'll get a Kindle and sort of load them all into that for when I want to read them. But I miss the actual books. That's the whole point of it. So print on demand, you know, has sort of helped keep things in print. Regarding classics, something it's done is it's meant that anybody who can scan a text in an old copy, they can take an old copy of anything, scan it into a scanner, they can become an ebook publisher and sell it through Amazon or whatever, or through their own website. So that's the thing. So self-publishing, let's get back to the point. thing with self-publishing is that if we talk about science fiction particularly, you'll see an awful lot of people are doing it. If you look on Amazon, you'll see tons of stuff. And I've been selling science fiction from pro publishers for, as I say, nearly 40 years, and I know backlists really, really well. And I know loads of the authors and stuff, and there's things I've never heard of, and some of them are probably selling really well. And you do come across the odd case where people have started doing self-publishing, and they've done it with ebooks, and some recent self-published books that eventually crossed over and become published by real publishers. If it's so good, why do they go to real publishers? There you go. Andy Weir, The Martian, he self-published that. It's with Del Rey now. Obviously had a Hollywood film made. If you look at Silo, the TV series, is it on Netflix or is it Prime? It's one of the two. I think it's Netflix, isn't it? Hugh Howey, those books were self-published initially, but they were quickly picked up. E.L. James, 50 Shades of Grey. But these things are the tiny, 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 infinitesimally small needlepoint tip of an iceberg, which is thousands and thousands and thousands of miles deep under a infinitely huge ocean. Okay, they're the exceptions that prove the rule. The number of people who make a sustained living and a huge amount of money over self-publishing is quite small. You get people who might make a little bit of money for a while, it'll die off. If they've got any sense and if the work is good, they will sell on and get a contract with a proper publisher. That's why Andy Weir's with Del Rey. It's easier. All he can do now is sit down, write the books. He's got a publisher, do all marketing, marvelous, good for him. So there you go. So there is that thing. If there's a book in everybody, maybe in most cases you should stay there. When a book is professionally published, people say, how do I get a book published? Well, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to write it, research the market, write something. Is the market going to buy it? People say to me, you've read loads of SF, you've had non-fiction published. Why haven't you written a novel? That's because what I want to write doesn't suit the market. It's that simple. And it hasn't suited the market for years. So one of the few options for me would be to self-publish. And I've sort of lived through the time when I could see the science fiction market changing, and it changed a lot late 80s, early 90s, and I became disenchanted with it. And I didn't want to do the sort of thing that was getting published, and I felt the sort of thing I wanted to do probably wouldn't get published, and I didn't really agree with self-publishing as it was then. Slightly different now. So when a book is professionally published, you've got to write it, or at least some sample chapters. You've got to find an agent, get an agent to pick it up. The agent will send it to the publishers. You might sell directly, what have you. But a lot of people don't do their research, okay? A lot of people also assume it's easy to write a science fiction novel. It isn't. If you want to write a good one, then it's a different matter. You need to do a lot of reading. My friend Tom Toner, the SF writer, who is a visual artist first, he said to me, the reason why you haven't written and published an SF novel is because you know too much about it. And it was clear to me when Tom and I first met, which was back in about 2016, we started talking, a lot of the things that I've read, which to me clearly influenced his work, he hadn't read. So they had filtered through other things. They had come from, say, Brian Aldiss or Jack Vance or Cordwainer Smith, and they had filtered through other writers like Ian M. Banks, who did influence him, into Tom's work, and he wasn't aware of them. So that is an interesting thing. Sometimes too much knowledge is a dangerous thing, but it's a question of the quality of the work that comes out. Increasingly, I've said elsewhere on the channel, I do think the quality of genre fiction has been descending. That's another issue. But the real thing is that when you go through that, you go through proper editorial, your grammar gets checked out, you have a team of people to help out with that sort of thing. And when I first started the channel, somebody asked me if they could send me a copy of a novel, which it wasn't entirely self-published, it's small press. The distinction between small press and self-publishing now, because of print on demand and because of e-reading files, has blurred enormously. Before, if you self-publish, you actually had to get the thing printed. Now you don't have to, only print it when you actually sell it. So there's a lot less risk involved, so the market has become more flooded. A lot of people would self-publish, they print stuff before they knew how to sell it, and they get burned. They print 500 and they had 490 sitting at home in their front room. So that's one thing how it's changed. Now it's different. And in a moment of weakness, I said, yeah, I'll have a copy of the book, showed it on the channel, and I picked it up to read it. And in the first line, there was a tautology. There were two words that meant the same thing in different parts of the sentence, and that's the sort of thing that an editor would pick on straight away. Okay, if that book had been submitted to a professional publisher, immediately the alarm bell would have rung. And there would have been other examples like that through the text. And they thought, well, first of all, this doesn't need copy editing. This isn't well written enough. There isn't enough fealty even to the basis of the technical side of writing. Now, you can talk about this all you will. There's an interesting example in the work of Raymond Carver, a very famous short story writer who's no longer with us, and huge literary reputation. But it's become common knowledge now that his editor would effectively rewrite a lot of stuff, and they were fundamentally collaborative books, and they should have had two names on the covers. But, Carver had enough talent and he had original ideas. He would do that thing. He'd write a short story, cut off the beginning and the end, and that became the new short story form for our age. So that was an important thing. So, you have these professionals who are trained to pick up on these things, to see whether the writing is good to begin with, because it may well be that a good editor can rewrite your book for you, but do they really want to spend all that time and money when there's something which is 99% perfect as opposed to only 40% perfect? So that's something to think about. So there's a lot of self-publishing going on. I'm not generally a fan of it, and I don't think it's that legitimate. And I think, in lots of cases, the book should stay there. If you want to be a writer, you should go through the professional channels and try and get things established that way, because you're more likely to deliver good books and books that sell. It's like a filtering process that will take out the stuff which isn't so good. However, the market is changing, and I did a video recently about asking the question whether female fantasy writers and female fantasy readers were destroying SF. And I said, no, they're not. It's actually publishers are putting too much money towards fantasy and not enough towards SF. And they're regarding them as the same thing, where they're two distinct markets, and very, very much so. And they should be putting more money into SF. The budget for the two things should be split. That's what I feel. But, you get lots of things. This is a book which I've read about a week ago, Travel Worlds by Alvaro Sina Samara, who sent me an email some time ago, really nice chap. And this was listed for some awards, and it's from a publisher called Fairwood, and it's Conversations with Robert Silverberg. It's basically a book-length interview with Robert Silverberg, who's one of my favourite writers, and I really enjoyed this, and Alvaro's a really nice guy. Got around to buying this eventually, and this is a print-on-demand book, okay? So I got this off eBay, and you'll see in the back, you'll see this in lots of books, and often you'll see printed by Amazon if it's from Amazon. Lightning Source are the UK's premier print-on-demand thing. They have the digital file, they'll print it off, and lots of publishers have their own print-on-demand thing. So basically, this book doesn't sit in a huge pile in a warehouse. It hasn't been run off, and there's 1,000 copies in Fairwood's warehouse. They print these books off as the demand is there, and they can keep doing that. So it's almost like a self-published thing. So lots of small publishers have popped up doing stuff like this, and the line between self-publishing and small press has kind of eroded. Once when a small press, you do a limited run of a book, it would often be by somebody who was quite well known, but it was, say, an unusual work. And I've talked on this channel about publishers like Kerosena and Morrigan, who I worked with in the 80s, great small press publishers who do a limited edition. They print 1,000 copies of an obscure book by, say, Gene Wolfe. 250 would be signed, numbered, and slipcase for the collectors. They'd be more expensive, and there'd be 750 trade copies, which would go out to bookshops, or they'd be done customer orders, and that was it. And none of this print-on-demand business. It was the real thing, and you had to sell that, and you had to cover the warehouse and cost you to sell the book. So it's a very risky thing to do. And some work I've done has been in books which are print on demand. I've contributed to a series called Deep Ends, and Deep Ends is for J.G. Ballard fans, and it comes out once a year. It reached 10 volumes, and the last volume has come out this year. And basically, there's a hardcover and paperback. They're not printed off and sit in a warehouse. They are run off and printed on demand, and they're quite high quality and they're nice. And it's run by Terminal Press, guy in Canada called Rick McGrath. Hi, Rick, really great guy. So it is a proper thing. He puts money into it. There's money into it, but it is effectively print on demand. So you see the boundaries have blurred. Now, as I say, I'm generally not a great believer in self-publishing. However, with changes in the market, the one thing that is legitimate, I think if you take a writer who has been legitimized by professional publication, they've written work, they've submitted it, it's been sold through bookshops, they've had some acclaim, whatever, and very often writers will have their time in the market. And recently I've been rereading the work of Gary Kilworth, who's a novelist, short story writer who is 83, and he's written 83 books. Gary and I met once. We did an event way back in the 80s, about 35 years ago, and he started his career writing science fiction. He wrote fantasy, children's books, he's written historical novels, he can write anything. Really talented guy, great writer. He's written 166 short stories, brilliant, but he's never had a bestseller. So he's a large output, done different things. He's been sort of nominated for awards. I think the Carnegie Medal mentioned him once or twice, acclaimed children's writer. And he published an autobiography a while ago, and he self-published it. And he self-published it because, of course, he's not high enough profile these days to get a mainstream publisher to publish his work. His work is in print as ebooks from Golank's Gateway and things like that. And there's some print on demand things. He occasionally does the odd book, which will come up through a proper small press like Newcon or PS. They'll do 500 or 1,000 copies. There'll be a certain number signed, what have you. And Gary is still working, he's still working. So he wrote his autobiography. He's a well-traveled man. It's a very interesting book. So there's that sort of thing. But he's legitimate because he is somebody who is a pro, who's been through that process of learning how to write, having stuff rejected, having it taken on, having it edited, learning his craft, going into different areas and becoming a really good writer. I mean, this is a guy who's published by Bodley Head at one point, okay? If you don't know what Bodley Head are, then, one of the great literary houses in the UK. His mainstream novels, his two best books, I think, his two best mainstream novels were published by Bodley Head back in the 80s. I'll be covering them on the channel at some point later this year. So Gary is legitimised. In a way, I'm legitimised because I've been published by Bloomsbury A&C Black. I think if you're legitimised and you can step back from your work and see when you've got a tautology, when your grammar is terrible, when it's not good enough, that's a slightly different matter. So the professional writer who's fallen from favour because the market has changed and critical ideas have changed, or what's politically okay has changed. Norman Spinrad's a classic example of this. He self-publishes now, and he self-publishes his old books, which were acclaimed in the 60s and 70s. He self-publishes new work. That, I think, is legitimate. But if you're coming in and you've never been professionally published and it's all very subjective, generally speaking, the work won't be good. But there is another caveat to this, which is that let's just say, for the sake of argument, you produce work which doesn't fit the contemporary narrative. And an interesting thing in science fiction and fantasy publishing these days is identity politics. And we know that the genres were dominated by white middle class, men for a long time, for historical reasons, not for any other reason, purely for historical reasons. And this sort of changed in a big way in the 1960s, where people like Samuel R. Delany came on board, female writers like Joanna Russell, Le Guin, and many others. And as I've said many times on this channel, those battles were won in SF a long time ago. They were won by the 70s. It's not something that somebody's invented recently. A lot of younger people think that all this stuff is new. It isn't. It's been going on for decades and decades, so it's not new. But we do have a very identity politics focused thing with publishing these days. So if you are writing SF or fantasy, if you're from an ethnic minority, or if you're female, or if you're LGBTQ+, instantly that's something you can be marketed on, because that's part of the zeitgeist. That's something that's been discussed a lot at the moment. And that's a good thing. But it's not to say it never happened. It did happen before. Anyway. However, if you're a middle-aged or old, like me, white man, you're unlikely to get published. Publishers want young people they can develop, what have you. They don't want somebody old who's going to pop their clogs in a few years, and they've spent all that time, building them up. Except they don't these days. Just 3 strikes and you're out mostly. But I think of Mary Wesley, the novelist who was popular in the 80s. She didn't publish her first book till she was 70. That's very uncommon now. And for somebody in a field like SF, where it tends to be, people tend to start young, to publish their first novel at 60 and over, is virtually unknown. I think George Turner, the Australian writer, was one of the few examples of that. And that was back in the 70s and 80s. It's a different world now. So there is that thing. So legitimacy can do it. Now, that market thing, if you're writing things which don't fit the narrative, there's a lot of books now which wouldn't get published because they'd be considered politically incorrect. A lot of Heinlein's books wouldn't get published now, not by a big publisher the way they were. If you look at Christopher Priest's Fugue for a Darkening Island, one of the key books of New Wave SF, classic English catastrophe novel, very ambiguous book and very daring book, and a brilliant book. That would not get published now because this would be simply too controversial. So if you're writing material which doesn't fit the narrative, or for which there's a small market, but publishers say, well, this is a good book, it's really well written, but we can't see a market for it, then self-publishing is legitimate as long as you can actually write well. So if you're going to do that, get professional editorial help. Okay, so that's my take on it. Self-publishing, you're not going to get your books into big chain bookshops unless you might get them into the local one. If it's a book about the city, you write a book about the city you live in, or set in the city, you're going to sell it in that city. If it's a general work of fiction or non-fiction, it's probably not going to happen. If you have a book inside you and it's bad, it should probably stay there. Vanity Publishing, you should never pay a publisher. You know, and these days you don't have to, you can do it yourself. If you must do it yourself through Amazon or what have you. You still have to market it, and that's the tough side. And, you know, attitudes are changing. My attitude is changing. I have a conservative attitude towards self-publishing. I don't generally think it's a good thing. I think really you should go through the professional routes. But if the professional routes are preventing some voices from being expressed, you know, I think that's a bad thing. And, you know, we're often told that certain minorities have been oppressed in publishing and their voices and their stories are not out there. That isn't true, and it's certainly not true anymore, and it hasn't been true for a very, very long time, is the fact of it. And, you know, new minorities are emerging. You know, maybe the sort of grey-haired old white guy like me is the new minority, so maybe I should get cracking and start typing. That's a project for next year. So that's my thoughts on self-publishing. Hope you enjoyed that. Comments below. Remember, if you do make comments, remember I've done this for a long time. If you state the obvious without some evidence to back up a new take on that, I'm just not going to really pay any attention to it. Professionals know what they're talking about. There is a general distrust of experts and expertise these days. I don't understand it. You know, you can learn off people. If I was going to do oil painting, I would be all over the experts. I wouldn't assume I knew more. I'd be all over the experts. So that's my take on that. Anyway, bye for now.